Formula 1 has already had its first major racing controversy of 2025, with the Turn 1 incident between Oscar Piastri and Max Verstappen in the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix strongly dividing opinions. One of the factors that's gone under the radar though is how some key revisions to F1's racing rules that came into force at the start of this season were critical of the decision the stewards made in Jeddah. While some have argued that punishing Verstappen for gaining a last advantage does not seem consistent with decisions made as recently as last year, it's important to understand that the guidelines that stewards are working with are different now. So in simple terms, what drivers can do in 2025 is not the same as it was in 2024. F1's driving standards guidelines are not in the public domain, as they're only circulated between the FIA and the teams and drivers, but we have been able to track down a copy of them. And we can shed some light on exactly what they say and, more importantly, what's changed for this year that impacts the racing. The original F1 driving standards guidelines document came into force at the start of the 22 season with some subtle amendments made for the following year. It was created as a way to put drivers and stewards on the same page when it came to understanding the rules of racing. There were not specific rules as such, but guidelines agreed with drivers that stewards would take into account for those moments when they had to make decisions about incidents on track that were under investigation. The document laid down in writing what drivers needed to do to be entitled to have racing room, either through an attempt to overtake on the inside or on the outside of a corner. And while it acknowledged that there were some caveats, because racing is a dynamic process with a lot of factors that need to be taken into account, the idea was that there were some specifics that could be singled out to help drivers better understand how they needed to behave. However, while it worked well for a while, some flaws were exposed in the wording of some of its clauses during the 24 season as things got close between Max Verstappen and Lando Norris in the fight for wins. For example, the requirement for a driver to have their front axle alongside the mirror of a rival no later than the apex was something that was quickly exploited. Some drivers well knew that diving for the apex and then worrying about the consequences afterwards would put them on the right side of the guidelines. Verstappen became the master of this tactic. He understood that being aggressive on the entry with a last-minute dive, sometimes even releasing the brakes to make sure he got to the apex first, was effectively allowed under the guidelines as it would comply with the wording to make the corner his. Yes, it was aggressive, but it was also totally legal, even if many of his rivals did not like the dive bomb aspect. But it was not just diving in that became a problem, because some drivers did not like a requirement for the car on the inside to leave a fair and acceptable width for the car being overtaken from the apex to the exit of the corner. It was felt that this was unnecessary, as in other categories of racing, the car on the inside, as long as it remained under control, had the right to use the track as it wanted. As Grand Prix Drivers Association Director George Russell remarked last year, if you're able to stay on the circuit, you're in your right to run the driver wide, as it's been for all of us since go-karting. If you're overtaking somebody on the inside, you've got the right to run them wide. Matters reached a head at last year's United States Grand Prix, thanks to two separate incidents that exposed some of the flaws with the original wording. The most obvious one was the Verstappen-Norris clash at turn 12, which earned Norris a penalty for getting a last advantage by overtaking his Red Bull rival off track. The stewards had argued that Norris had not had his front axle at least alongside Verstappen's at the apex of the corner, so had not earned the right to be left room. And this positioning of the cars was primarily because Verstappen had dived for the apex to ensure he was ahead, in fact carrying so much speed that he failed to keep within track limits. Earlier in the race, George Russell and Yuki Tsunoda were penalised for pulling off overtakes at turn 12, but then failing to leave enough room on the exit of the corner for the rival they were passing, even though both were fully in control of their cars all the way through. The controversies caused by all these incidents, as well as further Verstappen-Norris clashes in Mexico, prompted calls from drivers for changes to be made to the racing rules. They duly got together with the FIA at last year's Qatar Grand Prix and agreed on some tweaked wording to improve things for this year and get rid of some of the unintended consequences the original version had. And, based on what we saw with the Piastri-Verstappen incident in Saudi Arabia, drivers already appear to have adapted to the new requirements, which almost certainly look like they're going to cause further controversy this season. The wording of the revised guidelines are not radically different this year, but there are some very important changes that counted for a lot in the Piastri-Verstappen incident. One of the biggest emphasis shifts for this year is a move to give priority to the driver who's doing the passing. A key sentence at the top of the guidelines makes clear that an overtaking driver has priority, and it is the responsibility of the defending driver to avoid a collision or forcing off the overtaking driver. So let's take a look at what the rules say and how they're different to last year. In relation to a car overtaken on the inside of the corner, last year there were 4 key elements that had to be fulfilled. These were that for a driver to have earned the right to room when overtaken on the inside, their car must 1. Have its front axle at least alongside the mirror of the other car, no later than the apex of the corner. 2. Be driven in a safe and controlled manner throughout the manoeuvre, which includes entry, apex and exit. 3. without deliberately forcing the other car off the track at the exit. This includes leaving a fair and acceptable width for the car being overtaken from the apex to the exit of the corner, and 4. Be able to make the corner within the track limits. Following the Qatar meeting and that push to stop dive bombs and the need for drivers to always leave room for a rival, even when they've won a corner, the wording was tweaked. Now, the 25 guidelines state that for a car overtaken on the inside, it must 1. Have its front axle at least alongside the mirror of the other car prior to and at the apex. 2. Be driven in a fully controlled manner, particularly from entry to apex, and not have dived in. And 3. In the steward's estimations, have taken a reasonable racing line and been able to complete the move whilst remaining within track limits. The emphasis on the drivers needing to have their front wheels alongside the mirror of their rival prior to and at the apex may not be as definitive as it was before, but it's aimed at giving stewards a better indication of whether or not someone has just made a lunge to get their car into the right place at the apex only.
The Miami Grand Prix is almost here. Let's jump into our driver predictions using their latest prediction lines, courtesy of GridRival. Nico's current line is to finish higher or lower than P16, which feels too low. The Sauber may be F1's weakest car, yet street circuits bring attrition and chaos, perfect for a driver like him. He's been classified 16th or higher in every 2025 race except Bahrain, where he's disqualified from 13th, so we're taking better. Oscar's line is fairly aggressive at 1.5, meaning worse will hit with any other result than a win. While yes, he's won 2 of the last 3 races, 3 of 5 this year, Miami hasn't been his strongest venue, which we feel makes him less of a slam dunk for victory than what GridRival is placing him at. So we're going to have to go with worse. Yuki's line is 8.5. He's picking up steam at Red Bull and was excellent here last year in the Racing Bulls. While he currently has no top 8 finishes in 2025, his Saudi Arabian pace showed he's right on the cusp. So we're going out on a limb and backing better. Lando's Miami line is currently being boosted by GridRival to have him finish better or worse than 6th, rather than 2nd. Despite a few qualifying blunders, he's finished top 4 in every Grand Prix this season, and McLaren's Miami package looks strong. Especially considering Miami last year was his maiden win, better feels like an almost certainty. By putting these 4 picks into our GridRival lineup, we're at a 10 times multiplier, meaning a $10 entry could return $100 if they all hit. While we could add a few more picks to get this up to 100 times payout, we are staying conservative and we feel like this gives us a legitimate shot at earning a 10 times payout. If you want to tail us or build your own lineup for the race, scan the code and GridRival will match your first deposit up to $100. Picks is available in select US states, but fans everywhere can still play GridRival's free fantasy modes. Details below. Good luck in Miami!
If we dive a bit deeper into these guidelines and use them to analyse some incidents we've seen, the differences are obvious. Based on the new guidelines, for example, Russell would not have picked up a penalty at last year's United States Grand Prix for pushing Valtteri Bottas wide, as there is no longer a requirement for a driver who's won a corner to leave a car's width as long as they're fully under control. Using the guidelines to analyse what happened in Saudi Arabia this year, we can also see that Piastri ticked off all the necessary criteria in how he pulled off his first corner move. He had his front wheel alongside Verstappen's mirror both prior to and at the apex of the corner. He kept his car fully controlled in the manoeuvre, and he completed his move while remaining within track limits. Red Bull argued strongly afterwards through the use of the now famous onboard photo that Verstappen was ahead at the apex, so had the right to be left with racing room. However, according to the guidelines, this is an irrelevance as the defending car is no longer afforded room if the attacker has got their car into the right position and can maintain control to stay within track limits. All Piastri had to do, as the Red Bull photo actually showed, was to have his front axle at least alongside Verstappen's mirror prior to and at the apex, which he did. At that point, the corner's his, and let's not forget that Verstappen is still deemed the defending driver rather than the attacking one at this point. While Red Bull boss Christian Horner tried to argue that Max just can't disappear at this point in time, the guidelines are clear that Piastri had every right to use the full width of the track. So in this case, the onus falls onto the defending driver as to whether they concede the position as the corner is lost, or try to hold on as long as possible around the outside and risk running out of room. And this is a really important change to understand, because for this year, drivers that have lost a corner because a rival has got their wheel alongside their mirror on the inside can no longer expect any room to be left. In a letter that FI stewards sent to teams ahead of the season, it was pointed out in more detail the significance that there is no longer the need for drivers to leave room on the exit for rival if they've won the corner. The note explained, when overtaken on the inside, you no longer are required to give room to the overtaken car from the apex all the way to the exit, provided you are in control and within track limits. So based on the interpretation of the guidelines and what happened in Jeddah, we can see that Piastri had full rights to the corner and completed his move without exceeding track limits. It was clear then that Verstappen, cutting across the runoff and emerging with a bigger lead than when he entered the corner, was going to fall foul of the stewards. The driving standards guidelines do not just cover what drivers need to do when they overtake on the inside, because they also cover moves where a driver attempts to go the long way around the outside too. And there's been a subtle change in this area as a result of what we've seen last year. The 24 guidelines laid out 3 criteria that drivers had to fulfill if they were entitled to be given room, including the exit of the corner. They were to 1. Have the front axle at least alongside the front axle of the other car at the apex of the corner into the exit. 2. Be driven in a safe and controlled manner throughout the manoeuvre, including the entry, apex and exit. And 3. Be able to make the corner within the track limits. For 2025, the wording has been slightly amended. It now states that to be given room, the overtaking car on the outside must 1. Have its front axle ahead of the front axle of the other car at the apex. 2. Be driven in a controlled manner from entry to apex and to exit. And 3. Be able to make the corner within track limits. The changes effectively mean that a car overtaken on the outside now needs to be ahead of its rival at the apex, rather than just alongside as before. The expectation on cars battling for position, either on the inside or outside of corners, remain in place for track configurations where there are S-bends or chicanes, like turns 1 and 2 in Saudi Arabia. However, the guidelines here were also slightly tweaked for this year. Up until last year, the guidelines stated that the rules for cars overtaken on the inside and outside applied for each element of the combination. However, it added that priority will be given to the first corner element. That means if we consider that you didn't fully follow the guide and our considerations at the first corner, then you don't get the benefit at the second. This secondary element has been deleted for 25 and replaced with a simple sentence that says, generally, priority will be given to the first corner element. In explaining the significance of this change, the stewards told teams, "We have added the word generally in relation to being given priority on the second turn if you're in front of the first turn, because it's acknowledged that in some, probably rare situations, it might be able to execute a fair and safe overtake on the second turn, even if behind on the first." The driving standards guidelines also cover what the stewards will take into account when a driver leaves the track and cuts a corner, as happened with Verstappen when he ran wide at turn 1 in Saudi Arabia and rejoined after turn 2. Some new wording has been emphasised for 25 in relation to F1's sporting regulations that will be followed to the letter. The article now highlighted states, drivers must make every reasonable effort to use the track at all times and may not leave the track without a justifiable reason. Wording relating to how the stewards deal with drivers needing to give back a last advantage are unchanged, however, from last year. The guidelines state that if a car leaves the track or cuts a chicane while defending a position and rejoins in the same position, then it will generally be considered by the stewards as having gained a lasting advantage. The guidelines state that in this case, generally, the position should be given back as prescribed in the rules. It will be the sole discretion of the stewards to determine if the driver of a car is defending a position. In the case of Saudi Arabia, the stewards deemed that Verstappen had been defending, and by going off he gained a lasting advantage. With a tight fight for race wins at the moment, and overtaking increasingly more difficult, drivers need to know exactly what's expected of them when it comes to wheel-to-wheel moments if they're going to maximise their opportunities. In Saudi Arabia, Piastri played things to perfection in positioning his car and not leaving an inch more room than he needed to. Drivers no longer having the requirement to leave room for their rivals on the way out of a corner adds a fresh dynamic to racing, and it's one that will likely trigger a few more controversies as those on the losing end will feel they've been unfairly squeezed out. But F1's driving standards guidelines are something that have been agreed with teams and drivers, and changes are only made with consultation to ensure everyone is operating to the same rulebook and are crystal clear on what they are and are not allowed to do during these inevitable race-deciding flashpoints.